Have you ever trusted someone so completely? Loved someone so deeply that you never imagined they could orchestrate your complete destruction? Have you ever stood in a courtroom, watching everything you built with your own hands being ripped away by the very people who smiled at your wedding, who shook your hand, who called you son? That was me. That was my reality. And I'm going to tell you exactly how one single receipt, one forgotten piece of paper that I almost threw away, turned a nightmare into the most satisfying moment of vindication I've ever experienced in my entire life. My name is Michael, and this is the story of how my in-laws tried to take everything from me, how they dragged me through hell with smiles on their faces, and how justice finally caught up with them in the most unexpected way imaginable. I need you to understand something right from the start. This isn't just a story about money or property or legal battles. This is a story about trust, about family, about the people we let into our lives and the devastation they can cause when they decide to destroy us. This is about sleepless nights, anxiety attacks in grocery store parking lots, and the moment when you realize that the people who raised the woman you love are actively working to ruin your life. I never wanted to be the kind of person who ended up in court fighting his own family. I never imagined that one day I'd be sitting across from my father-in-law, listening to his lawyer paint me as a monster, a thief, a manipulator who had stolen from his daughter and his family. But that's exactly where I found myself, and the journey to that courtroom was paved with betrayal, lies, and a level of calculated cruelty that still takes my breath away when I think about it. Let me take you back to the beginning, to when everything seemed perfect, when I thought I had found not just the love of my life, but a family that would embrace me, support me, stand by me through anything. Let me show you how wrong I was, and how one moment of clarity, one piece of evidence that nobody expected, turned the entire situation on its head and gave me back everything they tried to steal. The first time I saw Sarah, I was standing in line at a coffee shop downtown, running late for a meeting, stressed about a project deadline, completely unprepared for the moment that would change my entire life. She was in front of me, fumbling with her wallet, apologizing to the barista because she had forgotten her credit card at home. Without thinking, without any ulterior motive or expectation of anything in return, I stepped forward and told the barista to add her order to mine. It was just coffee. It was just a kind gesture. But the way she turned around and looked at me, the genuine surprise and gratitude in her eyes, the warmth of her smile, something shifted inside me in that moment. We started talking, and that conversation that was supposed to last 2 minutes while we waited for our drinks turned into an hour standing outside the coffee shop, then turned into exchanging numbers, then turned into our first date 3 days later, and before I knew it, I was falling in love faster and harder than I ever thought possible. Sarah was everything I had never known I was looking for. She was intelligent, driven, passionate about her work as a graphic designer, but also kind and thoughtful in ways that made me want to be a better person. She had this laugh that could light up an entire room, this way of seeing the world that made even ordinary moments feel special. We spent every free moment together, discovering shared interests, having conversations that lasted until 3 in the morning, building something that felt solid and real and permanent. 6 months into our relationship, she told me she wanted me to meet her parents. I remember feeling nervous but excited, wanting to make a good impression on the people who had raised this incredible woman. I bought an expensive bottle of wine, wore my best suit, prepared myself to be charming and respectful and everything a potential son-in-law should be. The first meeting seemed to go well. Richard and Margaret Patterson lived in a large house in the suburbs, the kind of place that screamed old money and established success. Richard was a real estate investor who had built a considerable portfolio over the years, and Margaret came from a family with connections and influence. They were polite, asked me questions about my background, my career as a software developer, my plans for the future. I told them about the startup I was working on, about my dreams of building my own company someday, about my commitment to their daughter. They smiled and nodded, and I left that dinner thinking I had passed some important test. But there were small things, little moments that I didn't recognize as warning signs at the time. The way Richard's eyes narrowed when I mentioned that my own parents had passed away when I was young, leaving me with very little inheritance. The way Margaret's smile didn't quite reach her eyes when Sarah talked about how happy she was with me. The subtle questions about my financial situation, my assets, my plans for providing for their daughter. I brushed it all off as normal parental concern. as them wanting to make sure their child was going to be taken care of. I had no idea that they were already calculating, already planning, already seeing me as someone they could exploit. Sarah and I got engaged 18 months after that coffee shop meeting, and I proposed to her on the beach at sunset because I'm a romantic cliché and I didn't care. She said yes immediately, tears streaming down her face, and we called her parents right there from the beach to share the news. They seemed happy, or at least they performed happiness convincingly enough that I believed it. The wedding planning began, and that's when things started to get complicated. Margaret wanted to be involved in every decision, and I mean every single decision. She had opinions about the venue, the flowers, the guest list, the menu, the music, everything. Sarah tried to navigate between keeping her mother happy and making sure we had the wedding we actually wanted, and I supported her through it all, even when Margaret's suggestions became demands, even when her tone shifted from helpful to controlling. There were arguments, tears, tense phone calls that lasted hours, but eventually, we worked through it. The wedding day itself was beautiful, despite the stress that had led up to it. Sarah looked absolutely stunning, and standing at the altar watching her walk down the aisle toward me, I felt like the luckiest man alive. But there was a moment during the reception, a brief exchange that I replay in my mind now with perfect clarity. Richard pulled me aside, drink in hand, and put his arm around my shoulder, in what seemed like a fatherly gesture. He congratulated me, welcomed me to the family, and then he said something that I didn't understand at the time. He said that family takes care of each other, that now that I was part of the Patterson family there would be expectations, responsibilities, opportunities. He said it with a smile, but there was something in his eyes, something hard and calculating that made me uncomfortable, even though I couldn't articulate why. The first year of marriage was incredible. Sarah and I moved into a small apartment, nothing fancy, but it was ours, and we were building our life together. I had left my job at the startup and was working on my own software development company, taking on freelance clients while building the foundation for something bigger. Sarah's design business was growing, and we made a good team, supporting each other's dreams, celebrating each other's successes, working through challenges together. We were happy, genuinely happy, and I thought that was all that mattered. But Richard kept circling back, kept bringing up business opportunities, kept suggesting that I should let him invest in my company, that his connections could open doors for me, that families should do business together. I was hesitant at first. Mixing family and business seemed like asking for trouble, and something in my gut told me to keep my professional life separate from my relationship with Sarah's parents. But Richard was persistent, and eventually, he made an offer that seemed too good to refuse. He proposed a partnership where he would invest a significant amount of capital into my software company in exchange for a percentage of ownership. He showed me projections, talked about his business experience, convinced me that with his financial backing and connections, we could scale the business exponentially faster than I could do on my own. Sarah encouraged me to consider it, saying that her father was genuinely trying to help, that this was his way of showing he accepted me and believed in me. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We drew up contracts, had lawyers review everything, made it all official and legal. Richard invested $200,000 into the company, and in return he became a 30% stakeholder. At the time, it felt like a blessing, like a vote of confidence from my father-in-law, like the beginning of something great. I had no idea I had just handed him the weapon he would eventually use to try to destroy me. The business took off faster than I had even hoped. The software we were developing solved a real problem for small businesses, and word spread quickly. Within 2 years, we had gone from a one-man operation to a team of 15 employees, from barely scraping by to generating serious revenue. I was working 80-hour weeks, pouring everything I had into making the company successful, and it was paying off. Sarah was proud of me, and even Richard seemed impressed, though he also became more involved, more demanding, wanting more control over business decisions despite our agreement that he was a silent investor. There were board meetings where he would challenge my decisions, suggest alternative directions, push for strategies that I didn't agree with. I tried to maintain control, to remember that this was still my company, that his investment didn't give him the right to run everything. But he was subtle about it, framing his input as advice, as concern, as wanting to protect his investment. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, tensions began to build. Sarah started noticing changes in her parents' behavior toward me. They were less warm, more critical, finding fault with small things. making comments about my decisions both in business and in my marriage. Margaret would ask Sarah invasive questions about our finances, about whether I was treating her well, about whether she was happy. It felt like they were building a case, gathering ammunition, but I didn't understand for what purpose. I was making their daughter happy. The business was successful, everything should have been fine. Then Sarah got pregnant, and everything changed. We were overjoyed, excited to start a family, ready for this new chapter in our lives. But when we told Richard and Margaret, their reaction was strange. They seemed concerned rather than celebratory, asking questions about whether we were financially ready, whether I could support a family, whether Sarah should consider postponing her career. I reassured them that we were stable, that the business was doing well, that we had planned for this. But Margaret pulled Sarah aside that day, and when my wife came back, she looked troubled. She wouldn't tell me what her mother had said, just that Margaret had expressed concerns about our future. The pregnancy was challenging for Sarah. She had severe morning sickness that lasted well into her second trimester, and there were complications that required her to reduce her work hours and eventually stop working altogether. I took on more responsibility at the company, working even longer hours to make sure we maintained our income and could afford the additional medical expenses. Richard noticed that I was stretched thin, and he offered to take on more active involvement in the company to help lighten my load. Again, it seemed like a generous gesture from a concerned father-in-law. Again, I was wrong. He started coming into the office more frequently, sitting in on meetings with clients, inserting himself into decisions about product development and marketing strategies. My employees started coming to me confused about chain of command, asking whether they should be running things by Richard before implementing my directives. I had several conversations with him about boundaries, about the fact that while I appreciated his interest, I needed him to step back and let me run my own company. These conversations never went well. He would act hurt, saying he was just trying to help, that he was protecting his investment, that I should be grateful for his involvement rather than pushing him away. He started making subtle threats about pulling his investment, about exercising certain rights outlined in our partnership agreement, about making things difficult if I didn't cooperate. I consulted with my lawyer, reviewed the contracts we had signed, and discovered to my horror that the agreement contained clauses I didn't fully remember discussing, provisions that gave Richard more power than I had realized. Our daughter Emma was born on a rainy Tuesday in October, and holding her for the first time was the most overwhelming, beautiful moment of my life. Sarah was exhausted but radiant, and we both cried tears of joy as we looked at this tiny, perfect human we had created together. For a brief window of time, everything else faded away. The business stress, the family tensions, the money concerns, none of it mattered in the face of this new life, this new responsibility, this new love. Richard and Margaret came to visit at the hospital, and they seemed genuinely moved by their granddaughter. They held Emma, cooed over her, took dozens of photos, and I felt a surge of hope that maybe this would reset everything, that the birth of their grandchild would remind everyone what was truly important. Margaret even apologized to me for being difficult during the pregnancy, saying that she had just been worried about her daughter and her granddaughter, that she wanted to make sure we were all going to be okay. I accepted her apology, hugged her, told her that we were family and we would always work things out. I believed that we had turned a corner, that the worst was behind us. I was so incredibly naive. 3 months after Emma was born, Richard called me into a meeting at the company. He was sitting in my office behind my desk, which should have been my first clue that something was wrong. He had a folder full of documents spread out in front of him, and his expression was cold, businesslike, completely different from the warm grandfather who had been visiting to see Emma just days before. He told me that he had been reviewing the company finances and had discovered what he called irregularities and concerning patterns. He accused me of mismanaging funds, of making poor business decisions that had put his investment at risk, of using company money for personal expenses. I was stunned, completely blindsided by these accusations. I pulled up our financial records, showed him exactly where every dollar had gone, explained each business decision I had made and the reasoning behind it. Nothing I said made any difference. He had already made up his mind, or more accurately, he had already decided on his course of action and was just going through the motions of justifying it. He told me that he was exercising his rights under our partnership agreement to call for a full audit of the company and a review of my management. He said that if the audit confirmed his concerns, He would be taking legal action to protect his investment and potentially seeking to have me removed from my own company. I left that meeting in a state of shock, my hands shaking, my mind racing through everything that had just happened. I called Sarah immediately, told her what her father had accused me of, asked her if she knew anything about this. She was upset, confused, said she would talk to her parents and get to the bottom of it. But that conversation with her parents didn't go the way either of us expected. They told Sarah that they were concerned I had been taking advantage of her, that the business wasn't as successful as I had claimed, that I was hiding financial problems from her, that they were only trying to protect her and Emma. They suggested that maybe she should consider separating her finances from mine, protecting herself and her daughter from my poor decisions. Sarah defended me at first, told them they were wrong, that she trusted me completely. But they were relentless, planting seeds of doubt, showing her carefully selected financial documents that they claimed proved their point, wearing her down with their concern and their fear. The audit began, and it was invasive and humiliating. Auditors went through every transaction, every receipt, every expense report from the past 3 years. They interviewed employees, clients, vendors, asking questions designed to make me look incompetent or dishonest. Richard hired an aggressive law firm to represent his interests, and suddenly I was being treated like a criminal in my own company, like someone who had stolen from my own father-in-law rather than someone who had built a successful business, largely through my own effort and talent. The stress was unbearable. I wasn't sleeping, was barely eating, was snapping at employees who didn't deserve it, coming home exhausted and defeated every single day. Sarah was trying to be supportive, but I could see the doubt in her eyes, could feel her pulling away from me emotionally. Her parents were in her ear constantly, telling her that she needed to think about what was best for Emma, that she couldn't let loyalty to me blind her to potential problems that they only wanted to help. The audit took 3 months, and during that time, Richard continued to undermine me at every turn. He started reaching out directly to our biggest clients, suggesting that there were management problems at the company, that they might want to consider alternative vendors. We lost 2 major contracts because of his interference, which of course he then pointed to as evidence of my poor management. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, and he was orchestrating the whole thing. When the audit results finally came back, they showed exactly what I had known all along. There were no irregularities, no mismanagement, no improper use of funds. Every penny was accounted for. Every business decision was justified. The company was actually performing even better than I had reported. I felt vindicated, relieved, certain that this nightmare was finally over. But Richard wasn't deterred. Instead, he shifted his strategy. He claimed that regardless of what the audit showed, he had lost confidence in my ability to manage his investment, and he wanted out. He demanded that I buy out his share of the company at a valuation that was absolutely absurd, nearly 3 times what his investment was actually worth based on any reasonable calculation. When I told him I couldn't possibly afford that, he threatened to force a sale of the entire company to recover his investment. My lawyer explained that our partnership agreement actually did give him the right to force certain actions if we couldn't agree on terms, that I had signed a contract that was far more favorable to him than I had realized. I was trapped, cornered, facing the real possibility of losing everything I had built, and that's when things got even worse. Sarah's parents convinced her that she needed to protect herself and Emma financially. They hired a lawyer for her, separate from me, and suddenly I was being served with papers for a legal separation. Not a divorce yet, but a formal separation that would divide our assets and establish custody arrangements for Emma. The papers claimed that I had been hiding the true financial state of our marriage, that I had made risky business decisions without consulting her, that I had put our family's security at risk. These were all lies, or at best twisted versions of reality fed to her by her parents. But Sarah was scared, overwhelmed, postpartum and vulnerable, and her parents had successfully convinced her that protecting herself was the right thing to do. I tried to talk to her to explain what was really happening, but she wouldn't listen. Her parents had built such a convincing narrative, had so thoroughly poisoned her against me, that she couldn't see the truth anymore. She moved back in with Richard and Margaret, taking Emma with her, and I was left alone in our apartment, surrounded by the life we had built together, watching it all fall apart. The legal battles escalated quickly. Richard filed a lawsuit against me and the company, claiming breach of fiduciary duty, mismanagement, and fraud. The claims were baseless, but defending against them was expensive and time-consuming. Sarah filed for full custody of Emma, claiming that my mental state and financial instability made me an unfit parent. I was being attacked from all sides, drowning in legal fees, watching my reputation being destroyed, losing clients because of the rumors and the lawsuits, barely holding on to my company and my sanity. Have you ever felt completely alone, like the entire world has turned against you? Like no matter what you do or say, nobody will believe you? Have you ever watched people you loved, people you trusted, people you thought would stand by you forever, turn into strangers who seemed determined to destroy you? That's where I was, and I'm not ashamed to admit that there were days when I didn't want to get out of bed, days when I didn't see how I could possibly survive this, days when giving up seemed like the only rational option, but something in me refused to quit. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was anger, maybe it was the thought of my daughter growing up believing the lies her grandparents were telling about me. Whatever it was, it kept me going. I hired the best lawyers I could afford, even though it meant maxing out credit cards and taking out loans. I gathered every piece of documentation I could find related to the business, my partnership with Richard, my marriage to Sarah, everything. I was going to fight, and I was going to fight smart. My lawyer discovered something interesting as we prepared for trial. Richard had been far more involved in the company's day-to-day operations than our partnership agreement allowed. He had made financial decisions without my approval, had signed contracts in the company's name without authorization, had actually violated the terms of our agreement in multiple ways while accusing me of mismanagement. We had email records, meeting notes, testimony from employees about his overreach. It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in his armor that we could exploit. The custody battle was even more painful than the business lawsuit. I had to watch Sarah sit on the witness stand prompted by her lawyer, saying things about me that weren't true, painting me as an absent father, a neglectful husband, someone who cared more about business than family. It took everything in me not to break down, not to shout at her that she knew these things weren't true, that she was letting her parents manipulate her into destroying our family. My lawyer presented evidence of my involvement in Emma's life, photos and videos of me with my daughter, testimony from friends about what kind of father I was. But Sarah's lawyer countered with financial records showing the long hours I worked, the business trips I took, the stress I brought home. They twisted everything, made dedication look like neglect, made hard work look like obsession, made my efforts to provide for my family look like abandonment. The judge in the custody case was a stern woman named Judge Morrison, who seemed skeptical of everyone and everything. She asked pointed questions of both sides, clearly frustrated by what she saw as a family matter that should have been resolved without court intervention. She ordered a custody evaluation, appointed a guardian ad litem to represent Emma's interests, and scheduled a full hearing for 2 months later. Those 2 months were torture. I was allowed supervised visitation with my own daughter, had to see her in a sterile room with a social worker watching our every interaction, had to explain to a 14-month-old baby why Daddy couldn't take her home. Emma would cry when our visits ended. Reaching for me and walking away from her was like tearing my own heart out every single time. Meanwhile, the business lawsuit was proceeding to trial. Richard's lawyers had built an elaborate case claiming that I had defrauded him, that the company was failing because of my mismanagement, that he was entitled to damages far exceeding his original investment. My lawyers countered with evidence of Richard's interference and violations of our agreement, but we were outgunned. Richard had unlimited resources to throw at this case, while I was scraping together money for legal fees and struggling to keep the business afloat while fighting multiple legal battles. The trial date was set, and as it approached, I felt a growing sense of doom. I had truth on my side, but Richard had money, influence, and a legal team that was absolutely ruthless. I spent my nights going through boxes of documents looking for anything that might help my case, any smoking gun that would prove Richard's true intentions. I was exhausted, running on coffee and determination, barely functioning as a human being. And then 3 days before the trial was set to begin, I found it. I was going through a box of old receipts and documentation from the early days of the company, stuff I had kept for tax purposes but hadn't looked at in years. There was a folder of expenses from right around the time Richard had made his investment, and I was going through them mechanically, not really expecting to find anything useful. And then I saw it. A receipt from a private investigator's office, dated 2 weeks before Richard had first approached me about investing in my company. The receipt was for services rendered investigating Michael Torres, which is me, and it was paid for by Richard Patterson. I stared at that receipt for a long time, my hands shaking, my mind racing through the implications. Richard had hired a private investigator to look into me before he ever offered to invest in my company. He had researched my background, my finances, my vulnerabilities. He had known that I had no family, no safety net, no one to turn to for help. He had seen an opportunity to invest in a promising company and gain leverage over the founder who had married his daughter. This wasn't a father-in-law trying to help family. This was a calculated business move by a predator who saw someone he could exploit. I immediately called my lawyer, sent him a photo of the receipt, explained what I had found. He was excited, said this could change everything, that it went directly to Richard's credibility and his claims about trying to help me. We filed it as evidence, added it to our exhibit list for trial, and prepared to use it to dismantle Richard's entire narrative. The trial finally began on a cold Monday morning in March. The courtroom was exactly like you see in movies. Wooden benches, flags hanging behind the judge's bench, a feeling of gravity and consequence that made my stomach churn. Richard was there with his team of lawyers, looking confident and righteous, playing the role of the wronged investor who had trusted his son-in-law and been betrayed. Sarah was there too, sitting behind her father, not looking at me, and that hurt more than anything else. The first 2 days of trial were brutal. Richard's lawyers presented their case methodically, making me look incompetent, reckless, dishonest. They brought in an expert witness who testified about my poor business decisions, even though half of the decisions he criticized had actually been made or influenced by Richard himself. They showed financial projections that painted the company as failing, even though we were actually profitable and growing. They made it sound like Richard had entrusted me with his money out of the goodness of his heart, and I had squandered it through incompetence or malice. I sat there listening to myself being torn apart, watching the judge's expression, trying to gauge whether she believed any of this. My lawyer objected when he could, cross-examined their witnesses aggressively, but it felt like we were losing ground with every passing hour. When it was finally our turn to present our case, my lawyer started by establishing the timeline of Richard's involvement in the company, showing how his interference had actually caused many of the problems he was now complaining about. We had emails where Richard had contradicted my decisions, documents showing he had made unauthorized financial commitments, testimony from employees about his overreach. It was effective, and I could see Richard's lawyers getting concerned, whispering urgently among themselves. Then came the moment I had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. My lawyer introduced the receipt from the private investigator as evidence. He asked Richard about it directly on cross-examination, and I watched my father-in-law's face as he realized what we had found. He tried to play it off, claiming he had done routine due diligence before investing, that any responsible investor would research a potential business partner. But my lawyer pressed him, asking why he had never disclosed this investigation to me, why he had pretended his investment offer was motivated by family loyalty rather than calculated business strategy, why he had researched my personal background and vulnerabilities if his intentions were purely financial. Richard stumbled through his answers, his cool facade cracking for the first time. The judge was leaning forward now, clearly interested, asking her own questions about the timing and scope of the investigation. Richard's lawyer tried to redirect, to minimize the significance of the receipt, but the damage was done. The narrative had shifted. Suddenly, Richard wasn't the concerned father-in-law trying to protect his investment. He was a manipulator who had targeted his daughter's husband as a business opportunity from the very beginning. My lawyer then connected the dots between the investigation and Richard's subsequent behavior. He showed how Richard had slowly inserted himself into the company's operations, how he had positioned himself to gain more control, how he had manufactured the crisis that led to these lawsuits. He argued that Richard's entire claim was an attempt to steal the company from me, now that it had become successful, using the legal system as a weapon to accomplish through litigation what he couldn't accomplish through legitimate business means. The courtroom was silent as my lawyer presented his closing argument, weaving together all the evidence into a coherent story of manipulation and exploitation. He held up that receipt like it was a smoking gun, because in many ways it was. That single piece of paper undermined Richard's entire credibility, exposed his true motivations, showed the judge that this was never about protecting an investment or helping family. This was about power and control and greed. I looked over at Sarah during the closing arguments, and for the first time in months she was looking back at me. I saw confusion in her eyes, doubt, maybe the first glimmer of understanding that she had been manipulated by her own parents. I wanted to go to her, to talk to her, to explain everything, but all I could do was hold her gaze and hope she could see the truth. The judge took a recess to consider the evidence and arguments, and those 2 hours felt like an eternity. I sat in a conference room with my lawyer, unable to eat the sandwich he had brought me, unable to think about anything except what the judge might be deciding in her chambers. My entire future hung in the balance. My company, my reputation, my relationship with my daughter, everything. When we were called back into the courtroom, Judge Morrison looked stern and serious, which told me nothing about which way she was leaning. She began by summarizing the key facts of the case, the competing narratives that had been presented, the evidence that each side had offered. She talked about the complexity of business relationships between family members, about how trust and contracts can become intertwined in problematic ways, about how the legal system is supposed to provide clarity when personal relationships fail. Then she addressed the receipt. She said that while due diligence before an investment is normal and appropriate, the timing and nature of Richard's investigation, combined with his subsequent behavior and his failure to disclose this investigation to me, raised serious questions about his credibility and his motivations. She noted that Richard's testimony about his reasons for investing in the company was contradicted by his own documented actions before that investment was made. She found that Richard had violated the terms of our partnership agreement through his unauthorized involvement in business decisions, and that many of the problems he now complained about were directly caused by his own interference. She said that his claims of mismanagement and fraud were not supported by the evidence, particularly given the results of the independent audit he himself had commissioned. Therefore, she ruled in my favor on every single count. She dismissed Richard's claims with prejudice, ordered him to pay my legal fees and costs, and issued an injunction preventing him from interfering in the company's operations going forward. She also modified the partnership agreement to remove the problematic clauses that had given Richard excessive power, effectively reducing his role to that of a true silent investor with no operational control. The relief I felt in that moment was indescribable. My lawyer was grinning, shaking my hand, but I couldn't fully process what had just happened. I looked over at Richard, and his face was red with anger and humiliation. His lawyers were already packing up their briefcases, clearly eager to distance themselves from a losing case. And Sarah was staring at her father with an expression I had never seen before, something between shock and betrayal, and dawning realization. The judge wasn't finished. She said that she was going to be providing a copy of her ruling to Judge Morrison in the family court case, along with her observations about Richard's credibility and manipulative behavior. She said that she believed the family court judge would be very interested in understanding the context of the business dispute and how it related to the custody battle. She looked directly at Sarah as she said this, and I saw my wife flinch, saw her finally understanding that her parents had used her as a weapon against me, that they had manipulated her into seeking custody not for Emma's benefit, but to gain leverage in their business dispute. After the judge left the courtroom, I walked over to Sarah. She was crying, shaking, and when I reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. I told her that I loved her, that I had never stopped loving her, that I understood why she had believed her parents, but that I needed her to see the truth now. She nodded, unable to speak, and then she turned to her father. The conversation between Sarah and Richard was explosive. She demanded to know why he had done this, why he had lied to her, why he had tried to destroy her family. Richard tried to justify himself, saying he had been protecting her, that he knew what was best for her and for Emma, that I wasn't good enough for his daughter. But his words rang hollow now, and Sarah wasn't buying it anymore. She told him that he had almost cost her everything that mattered, that he had turned her against the man she loved, that he had weaponized her and her daughter for his own greed. Margaret tried to intervene to calm things down, but Sarah turned on her mother too, asking how she could have gone along with this, how she could have helped manipulate her own daughter. The confrontation spilled out into the courthouse hallway, drawing attention from other people waiting for their cases, and security eventually had to ask us all to leave. Sarah left with me that day, not with her parents, and that felt like its own small victory. We went back to our apartment, the one she had moved out of months before, and we talked for hours. I explained everything that had happened from my perspective, showed her the receipt and the other evidence that had been presented at trial, helped her see how her parents had systematically manipulated her perceptions and poisoned her against me. She cried a lot, apologized over and over, said she felt like an idiot for not seeing through it sooner. I told her that her parents had been extraordinarily calculated and convincing, that they had exploited her trust and her postpartum vulnerability, that I didn't blame her for being deceived by people she had loved and trusted her entire life. The custody hearing 2 weeks later was almost anticlimactic. Judge Morrison in the family court had indeed received the ruling from the business case, and she was not happy about what she read. She questioned Sarah extensively about her reasons for seeking custody, about whether she had been influenced by her parents, about whether she truly believed I was an unfit parent, or whether she had been pressured into making that claim. Sarah was honest, painfully honest, admitting that her parents had convinced her I was a danger to Emma's welfare, but that she now understood that wasn't true, that she had been manipulated. Judge Morrison was not pleased with Richard and Margaret's role in the custody dispute. She said that grandparents who use their children and grandchildren as pawns in business disputes are exactly the kind of toxic influence that courts try to protect children from. She dismissed Sarah's custody petition, established a joint custody arrangement that gave me equal time with Emma, and issued a restraining order preventing Richard and Margaret from having any contact with Emma without both Sarah and me present and consenting. The look on Richard's face when that order was read was almost worth everything I had been through. Rebuilding my relationship with Sarah wasn't easy or quick. There was a lot of hurt on both sides, a lot of trust that needed to be rebuilt, a lot of conversations about boundaries and communication, and how we were going to move forward. We went to counseling, both individually and together, working through the trauma of what her parents had put us through and what we had put each other through. Slowly, gradually, we found our way back to each other, remembered why we had fallen in love in the first place, rebuilt the partnership that her parents had tried so hard to destroy. We eventually reconciled fully and moved into a new house, a place with no memories of the apartment where everything had fallen apart or the apartment where we had been happy before. A fresh start, a new beginning. Sarah had no contact with her parents for over a year, and that was hard for her despite everything they had done, because they were still her parents, and she had loved them her whole life. But she needed that distance to heal, to establish her own identity, separate from their influence, to learn who she was without their manipulation. Richard tried to reach out several times, leaving voicemails that alternated between apologetic and accusatory, but Sarah never responded. Margaret sent letters, cards for Emma's birthday that we didn't open, gifts that we returned. They seemed to genuinely not understand why Sarah wouldn't just forgive them and move on, which showed how little they understood about the damage they had caused. The business thrived once Richard was no longer interfering. I bought out his stake in the company at a fair market valuation, taking out a significant loan to do so, but worth it to be completely free of him. We landed new contracts, hired more employees, expanded into new markets. Everything I had told Richard the company could become, it became, and he had no part in it and no claim to it. That was its own kind of justice. Emma is 4 years old now, healthy and happy and blissfully unaware of the legal battles that were fought over her when she was a baby. She has 2 parents who love her, who are united in raising her, who have learned through painful experience how important it is to protect our family from people who would try to use us for their own purposes. She doesn't know her grandparents on her mother's side, and maybe someday that will be sad for her, but right now it's what's necessary to keep our family safe. Looking back on everything that happened, I think about that receipt all the time. Such a small thing. A piece of paper that I almost threw away a dozen times while cleaning out old files. If I hadn't found it, if I hadn't kept such meticulous records, if I hadn't dug through that box of documents 3 days before trial, everything could have turned out differently. Richard might have won his lawsuit, might have taken my company, might have permanently destroyed my marriage and my relationship with my daughter. One receipt, one piece of evidence that proved what Richard's true intentions had been from the very beginning, changed everything. It exposed the lie, revealed the manipulation, turned the tables in a way that no amount of testimony or argument could have achieved on its own. That's what I want you to understand from my story. Documentation matters. Truth matters. Persistence matters. When people are trying to destroy you, when they're lying about you and manipulating the people you love and using the legal system as a weapon against you, sometimes all you have is the truth and the evidence to back it up. Hold on to that evidence. Keep those records. Don't throw away those receipts or emails or documents that seem unimportant at the time. You never know what might become the key piece of evidence that saves you. But more than that, I want you to understand that family isn't always safe, that the people who smile at your wedding might be calculating how to exploit you, that trust is a gift that some people will abuse in the most devastating ways. I trusted Richard because he was my father-in-law, because he was Sarah's father, because I wanted to believe that family meant something, and he used that trust to try to take everything from me. That's a hard lesson, and it's one that has made me more cautious, more guarded, less willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. Have you experienced something similar in your own life? Have you ever trusted someone who betrayed you, or watched family relationships turn toxic, or had to fight for what was rightfully yours against people who should have been on your side? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because I think there's something powerful in knowing we're not alone in these experiences, that other people have survived similar betrayals and come out stronger on the other side. Understanding what happened to me, understanding how manipulation works and how predators like Richard operate, that's important. It can help you recognize the warning signs in your own life, protect yourself and your family, avoid making the same mistakes I made. So take a moment and really think about the relationships in your life, the business partnerships you've entered into, the family dynamics that might not be as healthy as they appear on the surface. If my story resonated with you, if it touched your heart or made you think about your own situation differently, please leave a like on this video. It helps more people find these stories and understand that they're not alone in their struggles. And if you want to hear more true stories like this, stories about real people facing real challenges and finding ways to overcome them, make sure you subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. We share stories like mine every week, stories about betrayal and justice, about family and survival, about the moments that test us and the strength we find to keep going. Thank you for listening to my story, for letting me share this painful chapter of my life with you, and for being part of this community where we can all be honest about our experiences and support each other through the difficult times. Remember, the truth always matters. Justice is always worth fighting for, and sometimes one receipt can change absolutely everything.